Hello, everyone. This is a continuation of our study on Satan. And this might be kind of a short lesson. In fact, it's almost easy to combine this with the previous lesson. We were talking in lesson 2 about how God and Satan are not co-eternal and they're not equal. Satan is tolerated for the present time by God. And when the time comes, God is going to bring an end to Satan and evil and suffering without any help from anyone else. And then last week, we talked about where Satan comes from and his identity as an angel and kind of the things that we can sort of infer from a handful of Bible passages about who he is based on his nature as an angel. Again, he has no hope of defeating God, of overcoming God, but simply through his pride has rebelled against God, rebelled against his role as servant to those who inherit salvation. And it seems pretty consistent for him to want to rob God of as many of those souls as possible on his way toward defeat. But it still remained for us from last time to talk about Satan's actual defeat. And so I want to do that kind of briefly in this lesson. Again, just to remind us from passages like James 2 and verse 19 that Satan and his fellow demons shudder at the thought of God and God's power. So there's no thought that Satan is going to defeat God in any way, shape, or form. God is going to emerge victorious when God is ready. And the demons quake in their boots to think of that time. There's this great passage in Revelation chapter 12 that depicts this war in heaven between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon, that's Satan. And the dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. So that's an example of Satan already beginning to experience defeat. 2 Peter 2 and verse 4 is a passage we looked at last time about God not sparing the angels when they sin, but casting them into pits of darkness. There's some question as to the actual location of hell or Tartarus there. But anyway, reserved for judgment. And then Jude 6, which we also looked at last week, that angels that did not keep their own proper domain but abandoned their abode, he has kept under eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So there is a judgment still coming. And so we just try to ask some of these questions about when did all of this occur? Last week we asked the question, when did Satan rebel? And I think probably the best answer to that is that we first see at least Satan's rebellion when he tempted Eve in the garden in the form of the serpent. But a different question is, when did the defeat of Satan occur? Or maybe another way to look at it is, did it occur in stages? And I think that's probably what we'll discover when we finish this up. So was Satan defeated before the creation of man? Maybe. That probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Was Satan defeated at the cursing of the serpent? Remember that the Bible talks about how God cursed not only the ground and Adam and Eve, but he cursed the serpent also. But really in Genesis 3, that discussion is of a future defeat of Satan, that the seed of woman would crush the serpent's head, even though he would bruise his heel at the same time. So that's really the first mention of the gospel message that we have in Scripture, Genesis 3:15. And of course, all of the Old Testament story is to bring us up to that point when the son of woman, the seed of woman, who is Jesus, would come and defeat Satan. So perhaps the resurrection of Jesus is a great time that we can understand Satan being defeated. Then again, there is still some sense in which Satan is active and has power, which we'll look at in a moment. So maybe Satan hasn't been fully defeated yet. He is being defeated a bit at a time throughout biblical history until we get to a moment when finally he will be defeated. So let's look at some of the in-between times here. Let's talk about Satan after Genesis 3, but before the resurrection of Jesus. Let's talk about what we see Satan up to in the Old Testament. Even though he was cursed in Genesis 3:15, throughout the Old Testament, we still see Satan active and having a great deal of freedom. Not only does he walk about on the earth, but he also has access to God's presence in heaven. So, for example, the book of Job, chapter 1. Job, by the way, very likely being one of the earliest of the Old Testament books, perhaps even likely even before the law of Moses was given. Job chapter 1, starting in verse 6, says, "There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came in among them. The Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it.'" And then you may remember the rest of the conversation that they have. And then Satan comes back in chapter 2 and verses 1 through 6. "There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, 'Where have you come from?' Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job?' And etc. And remember that into Satan's hands was given the power to harm Job. So clearly we see, even though the serpent was already cursed and the doom of Satan at the hands of the seed of woman has already been mentioned, Satan still has a lot of power. He has access to God. He appears in the throne room of God with all the other sons of God, probably the angels. So there he is, and it doesn't look like his freedom has been curtailed very much. He actually is busy in all kinds of mischief. There's this really interesting passage in 1 Kings chapter 22 that I think is also very interesting. Now, it's a little bit harder to understand the identity of Satan here, perhaps, because it's not specifically mentioned, but 1 Kings 22, starting in verse 15, is where the prophet Micaiah is going up against some of the false prophets. And you'll have to read the whole chapter, which is very interesting. But the king asks Micaiah, "Shall we go to Ramoth Gilead in battle, or shall we refrain?" And with a little twinge of, I don't know if it's humor, probably more like sarcasm, Micaiah said, "Oh yeah, go ahead. The Lord will give it into the hand of the king." The king knows that Micaiah is not being legit. And so he asks again, "Speak to me nothing but truth in the name of the Lord." So he said, "I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep with no shepherd. And the Lord said, 'These have no master. Let each of them return to his house in peace.'" In other words, don't do it. Both Jehoshaphat and Ahab need to go home and not fight this battle because God is not going to give them victory. So the question is, well, Ahab's got all these other prophets who have already said, "Go and fight, and God is going to give you victory." So Micaiah reveals what's going on behind the scenes. This is in verse 19, 1 Kings 22. "Hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by him on his right and on his left. The Lord said, 'Who will entice Ahab to go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?' And one said this, while another said that. A spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, 'I will entice him.' The Lord said, 'How?' And he said, 'I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouth of his prophets.' He said, 'You are to entice him and also prevail. Go and do so.' And so Micaiah points out to the kings that the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets, and the Lord has proclaimed disaster against you." So it's pretty interesting to imagine the identity of this deceiving spirit or spirits as being those who are satanic. Hold on, let me pause here for just a moment. All right, so to continue, 1 Kings 22 would suggest that Satan is once again appearing in the presence of God and also busy about mischief upon the earth. So certainly no time in the Old Testament can we say that Satan's defeat has been final. There's still something more that needs to take place. And so that leads us to begin looking at the New Testament and talk about some of the things that he's involved with at that time. Christ, during the course of his ministry, mentioned the defeat of Satan, or at the very least mentioned the curtailing of his powers. Let's just look at these quickly. Matthew chapter 12, verses 25 through 29 is the first one. Matthew 12, starting in verse 25. Knowing their thoughts, Jesus said to them, any kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and any city or house divided against itself will not stand. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? If I, by Beelzebul, cast out demons, by whom do your sons cast them out? For this reason they will be your judges. But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. How can anyone enter the strong man's house and carry off his property unless he first binds the strong man? Then he will plunder his house. So what's going on there is Jesus is describing his ability and his disciples' ability to cast out demons as sort of the first step in the project of bringing Satan's kingdom down. It's kind of the first step in that defeat of Satan's forces. Look at another, Luke 10, verses 17 through 19. This is after the 70 disciples had been sent out to teach about the coming kingdom and also to heal and cast out demons. The 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will injure you. So again, I'm watching Satan fall from heaven, which should remind us of what that Revelation 12 passage talked about, Satan being cast out with all of the rest of his demons. And I do think if you look closely at Revelation 12, the context of that does seem to be surrounding the events of Jesus' incarnation and crucifixion and resurrection. So it would seem that the earthly ministry of Jesus is a key moment in Satan being bound and thrown down and no longer having access to the presence of God in heaven. One more, John chapter 12, verses 31 and 32. John 12, verses 31 and 32 says, judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. And if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. So again, just to reiterate what we're saying, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus has an awful lot to do with the defeat of Satan. Nevertheless, the New Testament, after the resurrection of Christ, still depicts Satan as walking around on the earth and still having some sort of power in order to affect the lives of human beings, to deceive them, to attempt to ruin the work of God, and to still put up a fight, as it were. So if you look at 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, a very, very famous passage, which we'll talk about later, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, and etc. So I think that it's reasonable to view the descent or the defeat of Satan in stages. Perhaps the curse was uttered in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3, around verse 15, but Satan still had access to the presence of God. When we come to the next stage is the death, burial, and especially the resurrection of Jesus, as we see Satan's powers further curtailed, cast out of heaven, no longer with access to the presence of God and the various other sons of God. But that doesn't mean he's done with. He has been thrown down and bound in some fashion. His powers are less, but as 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8 describes, he most certainly still has the ability to deceive and to despoil the work of God. Continuing in that thought, not Ecclesiastes, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 through 12, just one little part of that very important passage about taking on the full armor of God. Why? So that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. So we are still locked in a fight. And I think it's very helpful sometimes to realize that the decisions that I make, my choices whether to obey God or disobey God, my choices whether to allow an example of suffering to sweep me away from faith or not, my decisions to give in to a temptation or not, my decision to wake up in the morning and attend worship or not. All of these decisions are part of this conflict that rages in the unseen realms around us, where Satan, who still has power, is trying to destroy the work of God. He cannot be successful ultimately, but he certainly can be successful as far as I personally am concerned, that he could ruin myself or those that I love. Remember some of the names that Satan has, and that these names are used of him after the resurrection of Jesus. It's still he who is in the world. That's Satan. Satan, in Ephesians 2:2, Paul calls him the prince of the power of the air. He's still the head of the demonic forces. And 2 Corinthians 4:4, Paul calls him the God of this world. So obviously someone who is the God of this world still exercises a sizable amount of power. So let's now talk about Satan's future, just briefly. If the New Testament depicts Satan as cast down and bound in some fashion, and yet still active upon the earth, still has power, then there is a final defeat which still remains. And so let's just look at these couple of passages. Matthew 25 and verse 41, at the end of a long passage about God's judgment. At the end, he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, accursed ones, into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels." You know, that's a really sad point that only hit me recently, that Satan was not truly created or prepared for human beings. It was initially prepared for the devil and his angels. And what a sad thought to think that some of those who are made in the image of God, human beings, would have to share in the devil's fate. So I don't want to go there, but that's where those will go who reject God. And then the Revelation 20 passage, which is where this happens, that the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And while I believe that most of Revelation 1 through 19 has already been fulfilled, I don't believe that Revelation 20 has occurred yet. And that is something that will happen at the final judgment. And so that's the moment when Satan is going to receive the judgment that he has been promised. So just remember this when it comes to Hollywood depictions of Satan as dressed in a red suit with his horns and his forked tail and his little pitchfork, and he is sitting on a throne in hell, sort of comfortable, surrounded by the flames, enjoying the heat in his element, and reigning over all the other demons who are cavorting and frolicking down in hell. That is not an accurate description at all. Satan is not in hell yet. He has been cast out of heaven. He is bound and limited in some way, but he is still the God of this world, and he still has access to this world. And when the final defeat of Satan occurs, when God is ready for that, then Satan will finally enter into the lake that burns with fire. He will not enjoy himself. He does not want to go there. He will not be comfortable. He will be tormented day and night forever and ever, and he will reign over nothing. So that will bring Satan and evil and suffering to an end as the children of God dwell in God's presence forever and ever. Thank you so much for listening, and more later.